Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Margaret Crum. I'm with the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute, and welcome to this week's digital dialogue of the Grassland 2.0 project at UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have a privilege today to talk with Peter Lehner, who has co-written a really interesting book, which has occupied a good amount of the last month or so for me. The National Sustainable Ag Coalition has a group that's chose to do a workshop, or we have an ongoing book club around the very book, Farming for Our Future, which has just really been interesting as we're heading toward the Farm Bill, the 2020, presumably 2023 Farm Bill. And it's just perfectly timed to have this book be a focus within Grassland 2.0. Before I introduce the speaker, I'll just say that one of the things that's interesting is that Grassland 2.0 has really tackled some of the issues that Peter brings up and Nathan bring up in the book. Starts off very quickly with issues around racial equity. And I think Grassland 2.0 has done a notably good job of bringing this into the core of our thinking. And I really appreciate that the authors of the book have done the same. And Peter, I imagine you'll be speaking to it. Also, I think it's noteworthy that in the book, one of the greatest contributors to climate change that's spoken to and addressed in the book is animal agriculture. And guess what Grassland 2.0 really deals with directly? Animal agriculture. So that's really interesting. And I think Peter is interesting. So his history is fascinating. Currently managing attorney of the Sustainable Food and Farming program at Earthjustice, which is the country's largest nonprofit public interest environmental law organization. Up from 2007 to 2015, Peter was the executive director of NRDC, Natural Resource Defense Council. And I'll say that's particularly interesting to me because in that capacity, he hired a number of the people with whom I work. And I currently have a contract with NRDC and work very closely. Some of the best collaborators I ever worked with and just love working with them. And prior to that, he served with the New York State Attorney General's office as the chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau. And so this set of issues is really dear and important to him. He teaches a class now at Columbia Law School on agricultural and environmental law. And he also helps manage 2 family farms. So all sorts of things that make these issues both personal, conceptually important. And one of the things I especially appreciate about the book, I'll say, Peter, is that it's beautifully documented, but written in language that engages and really not polemicizes, but it takes a point of view. So with that, I'm just going to welcome you to join the group that has really productive discussions within Grassland 2.0. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. You can hear me, right?
We can hear you well. Thank you. And I'm going to mute myself.
It's great to be with you, and it's really great to be with everybody who's paying attention to this. I think all of us who work in the field probably feel a bit like, why aren't more people paying attention to this? This is so important. The impact of agriculture on our climate and on everything else we care about is so important. And yet, for the most part, it's something most people will ignore. Sure, they eat and they care about what they eat, but the politics of how our foreign policy is set is largely ignored by almost everybody except, essentially the Farm Bureau and the main growing organizations. So it's exciting that we're getting more people engaged to think about this. And before I share the slides, a quick thought is one of the things that maybe others have also found is ag is on the one hand everywhere, and on the other hand, really tough to address by our standard environmental laws. I've been an environmental lawyer most of my life, and I guess most of my working life. The environmental laws have really done a great job cleaning up our air and our water and many other aspects passed in 1970. But it turns out that they don't work that well with agriculture for a number of different reasons. Before I actually even started working for the state of New York, I worked for the city of New York for a number of years. And as people may know, New York City gets its drinking water from a series of reservoirs and watershed land in upstate New York. And as development pressures increased, we started having to pay attention to the water quality. But for a long time, literally decades and decades, it was such a rural area, the city never really worried about water quality. And one of the things we found is that if there was, say, a town with a sewage treatment plant that wasn't quite up to snuff and therefore had threatened or polluted a bit a tributary that flowed into a reservoir, we could essentially force them through the Clean Water Act to clean up their discharge. And yet, if there was a farm with a cow literally standing in the stream half a mile away, there was very little we could do. And interestingly, while everybody understood that human poop in drinking water is a bad idea, nobody seemed to be too concerned about animal waste in drinking water. So it was very strange how, even though they both contaminate drinking water, the law was very different, the politics were very different. And so everywhere we've been, we've seen that, that I've worked certainly, that agriculture poses a particular problem. And so that's why I'm focusing on it now. And that's why I'm so delighted to be here with all of you. So let me quickly share my screen. I think that will work, right? I'm looking at Carl. Can you nod if that's right?
Looks great, Peter. Thank you.
Okay, good. I subtitled this conversation about climate change and agriculture, cows, corn, and crap, because if anybody gets bored and wants to leave early, they'll have caught the main point of the talk right away. Most of the impact of agriculture on climate change is indeed from cows, as we'll see, the corn that is fed to cows, and animal waste. I'm sure it's different in Wisconsin, but maybe not all that different. In New York, we have a new climate change law, and we are trying to develop a plan to achieve our very aggressive goals. I'll actually be testifying at a hearing this afternoon. And these integration analysis that look closely at New York's emissions found that 92% of agricultural emissions in New York come from livestock. And so while nationwide, there's a larger portion coming from row crops, perhaps in Wisconsin, not too dissimilar from New York, the vast majority is livestock. So this is where we'll be focusing today. When we speak of, let me see here if this works. There we go. We'll be talking a bit about some of the challenges of the food system, some of the problems that we hope a new food bill and other legal reform and practice reforms and state laws can address. But one thing is I try to be careful about is not to use the phrase that our food system is broken, because even though it has a lot of unfortunate impact, it's actually doing what it's intended to do. Food policy, really for the last 100 years, starting with the Depression and the New Deal, has encouraged our agricultural system to produce a tremendous amount of inexpensive commodity food, not necessarily healthy food, without regard to environmental impacts, but quantity and cheapness was always really a major goal of most of our federal farm policy. So as a result, we produce a lot of food. As you see, 430 billion pounds of food. We also produce a lot of cotton, wool, and now an area about the size of Iowa growing corn largely for biofuel, for ethanol. It's a very international system. We export food, actually sort of relatively low quality food, grains and meats, and we import fruits and vegetables and fish. And as I'm sure everybody knows, we waste a lot of it. Much of that, some of that on the farm, I should say, but much of that in our homes and restaurants. But at the end of the day, it is cheap, and Americans pay a lot less for their food than they used to. On the other hand, what we're finding is, and a number of studies have come to this conclusion, that the true cost of food, if you include the hidden externalities, is about 3 times the market price. So even though our food appears cheap, it actually isn't cheap. And that is, I think, something that all of us know, and that's why we're working on this, because we know that even if it's cheap at the food store, the cost on our climate, on our water quality, on our loss of soil, on our public health is really quite significant and growing. It's also cheap because farmers don't necessarily get a lot of their income from actually food. They get a small portion of the food dollar, and USDA does these studies, what portion of farm income comes from US government handouts, subsidies, and it's an enormous amount. Often 1/3 to 1/2 of farm income is government subsidies, because farmers aren't getting enough of the actual farm dollar. So the system is doing what it's supposed to do, but as we look at it closely, one could wonder, is that really what we want it to do? Food that appears cheap but isn't really, and food that does not treat farmers themselves very well. So let's take a look at some of the impacts of agriculture. Many of this, I'm sure, will be familiar, so I'll go through some quickly. But of course, it uses most of our land, it uses most of our water. You drive around, you fly around, that is what you see. It's really, I find this graph somewhat extraordinary because of you can really see clearly the impact of animal agriculture in particular. That huge box in the middle, almost 800 million acres of grazing land, some of that federal land, some of that private land, some of it state land, but an enormous amount of land, and most of it is for cows because they have the first stage of their life, even though they end their life, most of them, in confined animal operations, they start their life on pasture. You see one of the other biggest boxes about where Kentucky and Tennessee are in this map is livestock feed. About half of our cropland is devoted not to food that animals eat, humans eat, but food that livestock eat. And of course, that's really quite inefficient. That's like an incandescent light bulb in a way. It takes about 15 pounds of grain to get a pound of beef. And so that is an extraordinary, in my view, waste of land and of grains to process it through these animals that are so inefficient. You see these relatively small boxes, such as the food we eat is surprisingly small on this. And as you all know, it uses much of our water. In areas like, I think for you and for us in New York, it's a pretty wet area, the north. But certainly for the arid Midwest, where aquifers are running dry, for the further west in California, where the snowpack, because of climate change, is changing, the water use impacts will get far more significant. So we could spend a lot of time on this, and again, I want to focus on really where we go from here. But I think it is important. This is where many of those hidden costs are. A tremendous amount of water pollution. And this is really how I got became aware of agriculture's impact, because I was representing the city of New York and realizing that we were spending tens, then hundreds of millions of dollars to protect our drinking water supply. And as I said at the beginning, much of that from agricultural contamination. And if you think about it, that is going on all around the country, that Americans in urban areas, very often municipal areas, are essentially paying the cost because of agricultural pollution, which is contaminating their source water, requiring the water suppliers to treat the water more heavily. And of course, not all the water is treated. Much agricultural pollution seeps into groundwater, And that is, you've heard, I know of the blue baby syndrome and other contaminants that's from nitrate pollution, but also pesticides and herbicides and others that are found in groundwater. So we've got a tremendous challenge there. And then on the other hand, agriculture uses a tremendous amount, the largest quantity of pesticides. And you all know that if you were to take a blood or urine sample of yourself or any of your friends, you would find probably a couple hundred synthetic chemicals, maybe half of which would be pesticides. They're in all of us. We don't know much of what they do. We certainly don't know much of what they do in synergy with each other. And pesticides, of course, are a little funny. Many chemicals, toxic chemicals in our life, we use for one purpose, and the fact that they're toxic is an unfortunate side effect. But of course, pesticides are meant to be toxic. They're meant to kill things. So it's not a surprise that they are harmful to our health. One of the shocking things that I discovered is, or I read, and I didn't discover it, but we really came to see it during the COVID crisis when diet-connected chronic diseases were major risk factors for COVID. And now, according to most studies, diet-related disease causes more public health harm than smoking. So that's a sort of remarkable idea if you think about it, that our food system that is meant to provide us nutritious food and keep us healthy and strong and be able to keep going is actually now getting us sicker than smoking, which we all know is terrible for our health. So that's a little worth really thinking about. And that goes back to what is the food we're producing. We're producing vast amounts of commodity foods that have these diet-related chronic disease challenges. And in animals in particular, as you probably know, about 70% of medically important antibiotics are used in animals, not when your kid is sick with strep throat, but on healthy animals to compensate for the unsanitary conditions that they're kept in. And as a result, that leads to antibiotic resistance, as well as human overuse. It's not only animal overuse, but most of the antibiotics are used in animals, and in ways that I admit I don't fully understand. I've read about this, but the ability of antibiotic resistant bacteria to jump from animals to us and change bacteria, but the resistance goes from one type of bacteria to another, is really terrifying, which is why organizations like CDC, the World Health Organization, and others say that we could be facing a pandemic of antibiotic-resistant disease that makes COVID look like child's play. And already about 35,000 people a year just in the US die from antibiotic-resistant disease. And finally, on the right of the screen, any environmentalist is aware and spends a lot of time often thinking about biodiversity and wildlife. And we think of that as a biodiversity issue, but much of it at the end of the day is really an agriculture issue. Agriculture is the main driver of habitat loss for species because of all this pesticide use. It's one of the main drivers of toxic exposure to wildlife. So our biodiversity crisis is also profoundly affected by our agricultural system. But less well known, and this is where we're going to be focusing, agriculture drives a lot of climate change. And as everyone knows, the climate change is burning fossil fuels and carbon dioxide, right? Well, in fact, part of what's confusing is while there's some carbon dioxide emitted from agriculture, from fossil fuel burning, say for on-farm energy, on-farm electricity, and of course throughout the food system, and the manufacture of inputs like pesticide and fertilizers, most of agriculture's contribution to climate change comes from other than carbon dioxide. The most significant is methane, and methane really comes largely from cows. Their rumen, which is their stomach, acts differently than ours, so they are releasing carbon dioxide with every time they exhale. And then animal manure, especially if it's managed in wet systems, produces a tremendous amount of methane. Animal manure, if it's handled in a dry system, produces much less methane, and we'll see. So that gives an opportunity for a bit of a solution. But so it's largely cattle belching. It's not, and that's cattle, not pigs and chicken, but animal waste. And this is the liquid manure is largely from dairies and swine, although other sources as well. And rice also creates methane, as does food waste rotting in the landfills. The other major source of agricultural greenhouse gases is nitrous oxide. When we apply fertilizer to crops, nitrogen fertilizer, as we know, not all of it gets absorbed by the crop. In fact, studies show maybe about half gets absorbed by the crop, and the other half has to go somewhere. And much of it runs off into the waters, and that causes harmful algae blooms, that causes the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico and in other estuaries and lakes. And it can seep into groundwater, where, as I mentioned earlier, it can affect blue baby syndrome and others. But some of it actually also gets converted into nitrous oxide and goes into the atmosphere. And that nitrous oxide is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas, about 300 times stronger than CO2, and also one of our most significant ozone depleters. So those are the biggest gases coming off. But you also have another area that is important to mention, and is largely, even when like EPA's inventory, which you see in this upper corner here, says agriculture is worth 9%. Actually, I haven't figured, I've got to update that now. This year just came out, agriculture says 11%. But this is really looking only at nitrous oxide and methane. It's not looking at, for example, the manufacturer, the impacts of the manufacture of pesticides or fertilizer or energy or electricity, all of which are in other sectors, other parts of this pie chart. And similarly, it doesn't address the impact of land use. And that is if you think about that map, there was all that land that had been converted to agriculture. And when grassland or forest land is converted to agriculture, you have a very significant carbon impact. What happens is when you first, as you see on the left of this page, you first lose a lot of soil carbon when you till the land or cut down the trees or dig up the grassland. And the carbon that had been stored in the trees or in the soil is generally lost to the atmosphere, carbon and oxygen in the air, carbon dioxide. And then that soil tends to also just not be able to grow back. This again, I'm going to foreshadow an opportunity we have to change some practices to reverse this curve a little bit. But under conventional practices, there isn't much carbon in the soil and it stays without much carbon. But one of the things that, and that loss of carbon isn't included in the EPA agriculture portion. That's in a separate portion of the pie chart. And this second part, which you see on the right-hand side of the page, isn't considered at all in the EPA inventory. But if you think about it, all that land used to be sequestering carbon, not just storing carbon, but every year pulling more carbon out of the atmosphere. And now it's not doing that. And so there really is an opportunity cost. If you think of it differently, think about the fuel, the biofuels. If you have some gasoline that's produced with a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions and no land, and you have some other fuel that is produced with, the same greenhouse gas emissions, but it takes 30 million acres, clearly that one with 30 million acres has somehow a much bigger carbon impact because you're not using that 30 million acres for storing and sequestering carbon. And that carbon opportunity cost, which we discuss in our book, is never really considered much, but really is an important part of agriculture's footprint. So if you look at this together, what you see is the little bar to the left here is EPA's wedge, which you saw on that pie chart. If you add in all these other elements, the fuel and electricity and fertilizer production that is used on the farms, and it's important to include it because farm policy will then affect what happens on the farm. So farm policy will affect these things. what we say is policy relevant timescale is EPA analysis uses the old sort of more standard former view of a 100-year timescale. And under that, methane is about 20 or 25 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. In the most recent IPCC report, and many other scientists are saying, whoa, look, we have to actually be thinking on a much faster timescale. And many, for example, New York's law talks about goals by 2050. Companies and states are looking at goals by 2040 or 2050. And if you think about that policy relevant timescale of 20 years or so, methane is not 25 times stronger, but 85 times stronger. And that really creates a much bigger, makes agriculture's contribution, since agriculture contributes most of, is the largest single source of methane in the US, very significant. And then if you add what I was just talking about, this land conversion and the opportunity cost, you can see that the actual climate impact of agriculture is much, much bigger than is commonly reported. And it's really about the same as the transportation sector, something that most people have not a clue of. And I emphasize this because so often the conversation is, oh, let's focus on fossil fuels, agriculture can be an afterthought. And I would like to impress on all of you, which I think you already know, that's why you're listening, agriculture cannot be an afterthought. It's so important, and it's much more important than most people realize. And this important has a wonderful flip, which is if we address agriculture, the impact on helping to address climate change is even bigger than we might have thought. Now, before I get into how we respond, I think, again, everyone realizes, but this is actually an important factor, frankly, for politics as well as for that we all have to deal with, is that agriculture is on the front line of climate change. Even farmers who don't acknowledge climate change, and there are fortunately fewer of them, know that weather is changing. In the farms that I manage, whew, man, it is, I mean, it's really shocking, the difference in the weather patterns, the extremes. We're seeing pests that hadn't been a problem before that have hit the entire region with devastating impact on our crops. And this is all very real. And farmers in every part of the world see this. And some of this is very clear, the floods and the droughts that are more frequent and more severe. Some of it is a little more subtle, that your growing season has changed a little bit earlier, a little bit later, and maybe you're out of sync with some of the pollinating insects. Some of it is really still just to be determined. There's been a number of studies that suggest that the additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the warming is sort of like giving plants junk food. They grow a little faster, but their nutritional content is declining. And for folks who look at nutrition and public health around the world, this has been one of the most unnerving elements, are some of the staple crops that literally hundreds of millions of people rely on seem to be less nutritious than they were 20 years ago. So there's a real impact of climate change on agriculture, and in order to address food security, as well as farm security and rural community security, we really have to address this and address it quickly. The good news is that I firmly believe, and I think we tried very hard, as Margaret noted, to document everything in our book with studies, because there's a lot of what people say one way or the other. There's misinformation, there's intentional disinformation, there's hype that is sometimes saying things are super silver bullets, and there's hype the other way, is things that nothing can happen, and we have to absolutely keep our current system, which is industrial scale, very heavily dependent on agrochemicals, vast monocultures, and that is necessary to feed the world. So we hear that on all sides. And after reading hundreds and hundreds of papers, talking to hundreds of farmers, literally, and my own experience, but one doesn't want to rely too much on anecdotal evidence, but really doing the study, I think we really can say with quite some confidence that there are better ways to feed people than this current system that will produce better food with many fewer environmental impacts. They can be highly productive, and that's it's sort of stunning how productive they are, given how little R&D, how comparatively little farmland is devoted to these practices. If we really put some effort into it, they will be even more productive. And so that is the question: how do we get there? These are all practices that you know about. I love this picture, which is the only picture I'll show, between perennial plants and annual plants, and the root system of the perennials is on the right, and the root system of the annual on the left. And you can imagine, not only does that store a lot more carbon, it's going to be far more resilient to floods and droughts and heat waves and pretty much anything, and pests and others. And so these practices that have been used in really all parts of the country at all scales and almost all crops include using perennial crops, more careful fertilizer management, rotating crops, cover crops, prairie strips, and similarly with livestock, really changing how you manage the grazing phase, how you manage the manure in a confined operation, adding trees to almost everything. And there are tremendous opportunities here. And these have been pretty well demonstrated, as I said. And so we did something fairly simple. We sort of used those practices and imagined they were applied on the land to which they could be applied in the US. And using the COMET planner, which, as you know, is done by NRCS and Colorado State, for figures of, well, what would be the climate benefit if we use those practices on the applicable land. And you can see just some of the practices, and this really doesn't even address some of the ones like dry manure management, which would be a significant reduction in some of the manure methane. But this shows you the promise of this, that if we really were to shift to these practices, we could be reducing emissions and increasing soil carbon, equivalent to what EPA is now saying are the current emissions. So this is the hope, and this is the reality, which is that these practices are used on only a tiny portion of US cropland and US grazing land. So it is, our challenge is, how do we scale up these practices? And there's been a number of studies, again, to show that we have some idea of why these practices aren't being scaled up. Farmers don't know. They need new equipment that they don't want to buy until they're sure it's going to work. There's certainly a lot of cultural attitudes. They're concerned if it's a little risky, are they going to be protected from that risk? All of the things that I'm sure any of you working in the field have dealt with. But as we know, as I started at the very beginning, our current farm system is not a pure result of markets and farmers doing exactly what their land tells them to do, but rather because of federal policy. Federal policy has an enormous impact on what farmers grow, where they grow it, how they grow it. So if that policy can shape our current system, changes to the policy can change our system. So we have a few recommendations that I'll offer, and then we'll open it up for discussion. One is sort of the equivalent of the doctors do no harm. Let's at least not make it harder for those farmers who want to use more sustainable practices to do so. And yet our crop insurance and commodity payment does that. Our commodity system, for example, requiring a 10-year track record before you can get your payments, makes it pretty hard to have a type of long rotation, which is going to be ecologically better. and cover crops can be viewed as competition to cash crops. And the development of these new practices getting sort of into the book is a slow and arduous process. So all of this can think of this as, hey, these are farmers who want to do this. Let's at least not make their life too difficult. And similarly, those who are grazing on federal land sometimes find barriers there. They, under both BLM and Forest Service rules, if you reduce the number of animals because it's appropriate to the terrain, the weather, the changing forage capacity of the land, the government agency can actually penalize you for not grazing up to the maximum, even if that maximum is clearly harmful. So one is, let's do no harm and let the farmers who are trying to do the right thing, give them a better chance. And then the second is, let's give them a boost. We now are spending billions of dollars in the Farm Bill, as you know, every year through the commodity programs, the crop insurance program, the conservation programs to farmers. And many of these practices we're finding actually are not necessarily productive. The NRCS did a review and found that many of the practices that are supported are actually, and this is NRDC's view, not my view, are actually counterproductive from a climate and environmental perspective. So why are we funding farmers to do something which government studies have actually found don't meet the conservation program's goals? Why? The answer is because that's what was done a while ago before we knew better. Now we knew better, we should change. Lots of opportunities to better target our conservation dollars. This is billions of dollars every year that can be better targeted to climate-friendly practices. And now that we know more about which practices are more effective, it'll allow us to shape this a little more. One of the important elements I would say here that could be tricky, but I would urge everyone to really think about is the importance of getting more data. The farm sector tends to have much less data, much less oversight than many other areas. There's often a feeling of, it's private information, even when it's funded by the taxpayer. And that means it's harder to provide oversight to make sure the taxpayer is getting something of value. It's harder to know whether these practices are working as well as we would like, or how they could work better. And it's hard to share information. So data sharing is going to be, I think, a really critical step, important step when we look at the 2023 Farm Bill to really underlie everything. If we need to know better what is being done, the impact of changes and where our money is going, and ensure that it is well spent. This is, a lot of simple areas. Well, let me say, everyone I'm sure knows about the Conservation Reserve Program, which takes lands out of production usually for 10 years. And that has some benefits, but it also often those are temporary. Much of the land goes back into production after 10 years, and so the accumulated soil is lost. So there was in the 2018 Farm Bill some provisions to allow in certain areas a 30-year program, and we would urge much more attention for longer term agreements, including much more permanent agreements, but also targeted much better. Riparian areas have enormous conservation and climate value, and yet, as you see, a lot of them are not protected. And fortunately, we now know much more about which lands are ecologically better, which are often, by the way, lands that are less productive from a farming perspective. And so there can be a confluence. It just takes a lot of work and pushing to get us there. I would hope that this one wouldn't be a hard sell, but it often is. I remember this wonderful study out of UC Davis that I think found that agricultural R&D has about the highest return of virtually any form of R&D in any sector of the economy. And yet in the US, our R&D is half of what it used to be. And much of that has been taken over essentially by private companies' research. But private companies look at different things. They look at products that can be patented and marketed, whereas public research provides open source information of practices and technologies that can be shared and that aren't necessarily marketable, but would have a much bigger climate impact. There are a lot of opportunities, programs actually within USDA that exist. They existed for a while. Many of them were on sort of life support, existing almost only on paper during the Trump administration, have now been expanded a bit, but all of which could be expanded even more to provide the opportunity to take these practices, which, as I said earlier, we know work, but have been used on only a tiny fraction of US land. And imagine if we really put some research into them and started doing them much more. They're already productive. They're already amazing in their impact of ability to produce food with less or much less environmental impact. If we put some more research into this, those will be almost surely much better. We all see that, and I know this from my own experience, doing something different is scary. And we have to help farmers take on new projects. And that is both knowledge and information with training and outreach and technical support. It is also funding to make sure we have technical assistance people out there. Right now, according to a recent study, the most common source of information for a producer is an agrochemical company salesman. And as you can imagine, they're going to have a particular point of view that may not coincide with what is best for either the farmer or for the public at large. So let's have more support out there for the farmers. And then let's also finally look at all the other laws. Everything I've been talking about is largely focused on the Farm Bill opportunities. And the Farm Bill really is a special law, unlike the Clean Air Act, which was last amended in 1990, the Clean Water Act that was last amended in 1987. So we're sort of stuck with the laws that we have because, especially now with the political paralysis, it's pretty hard to imagine we're going to get an amendments to those major laws. But the Farm Bill has to get reauthorized every 5 years. And so there is a chance for change there because essentially Congress is forced, whether they like it or not, to address the Farm Bill. And so there are great opportunities, and that's what I was looking at earlier. But here we also have to recognize that these other laws do have an impact on agriculture, and the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the energy laws, all of which can either drive practices that are environmentally more troubling, like the renewable fuel standard, or they can be very important, like driving renewable energy, winds and solar, and energy efficiency on farms, or the Clean Air Act addressing both the conventional pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from CAFOs, and Clean Water Act, similarly, which can be certainly strengthened even without changing the law to address some of the both water pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from concentrated animal operations. So lots of opportunities in other areas of law. It's not just a USDA Farm Bill opportunities, although there are many there, but throughout other sectors of the other agencies of the government, other laws, and of course, there's the parallel at the corporate level. And we address this, I should say, in our book, a big chapter on the Farm Bill, but other chapters on other agencies, opportunity, other laws, and what the corporate and private and philanthropic sectors can do. And I don't know if this is appropriate, but I can't help to end with what anyone can do individually And I think all of us have sort of the ability to act as citizens and act as consumers, our political action and our personal action. And they often overlap. The more you take action that is consistent with what you're advocating for, the more knowledgeable you are, but also you see some of the need for it. To use a non-agricultural example, the more you bike around, the more you'll be an advocate for bike lanes. So what I really urge environmental folks to engage in is to pay attention to the Farm Bill. It's going to happen with you or without you. And so try to get in there. And I think there's a real opportunity not only to look at these incentives, these trainings, but to recognize that just as well as in every other sector of the economy, there's a distinction between the big operators and the small operators. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act have thresholds of size. The big ones are regulated, the small ones are not. When these laws were passed in 1970, virtually all agricultural operations were small. And they were just beginning to consolidate, just beginning to grow. But in the 50 years since then, as we've all seen, and it happens nationwide and in every state, the average size of the farm or the animal operation has grown up dramatically, and the number of operations has gone down. The number of active productive operations has gone down. We still have a lot of tax farms and hobby farms, but they don't produce much of our food. So those industrial scale facilities, I would argue, should be recognized as for the industries they are and addressed accordingly, as we are also using our Farm Bill capacity to help move the smaller scale and mid-scale operations to more sustainable practices. And since we're talking ultimately about agriculture, we're also talking about food, and everybody makes food choices pretty much every day. And there are significant differences in your food choices. And as people make those choices, that will resonate up the food chain and up the production chain. So I would urge people to make personal action through their diet as well as through their political voice. And with that, I'll say thank you. Stop sharing my screen and turn it back to Margaret and Carl.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm sure that I'm speaking for everybody and appreciating the rapid and comprehensive and thoughtful and provocative way you've provided a framework for our conversation. So I just sent a note in the chat, encouraging folks with questions to put them into the chat. It'll make it a little easier to organize a logical flow in some of the questions, because I suspect we'll have plenty. I will offer Randy, if you want to ask a question to start us off relating to Grassland 2.0 and what we're trying to do, and what you see as our agenda and where it fits in the challenges and potential solutions that you've heard Peter bringing to everybody today. And I see, Randy, you say you can't.
No, somebody flipped the switch. Thanks, Carl. Thank you, Peter, for a wonderful presentation. So insightful, so inspirational. As Margaret mentions, Grassland 2.0 is very much about trying to restore the functionality of the original grassland, of the original prairie, to our agricultural systems. And we know the original prairies were grazed by livestock and provided for people, probably at somewhat smaller scales and all that, but provided for people nonetheless, and probably were a net source of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. We could argue about that all day, but one of the questions that always comes up is, should we be trying to work towards a net zero livestock industry? Is that really a reasonable thing? And of course, a lot of work has gone into if grasslands themselves have the ability to build carbon in their soils, then that could offset the methane that's coming from the livestock. And so we've done some calculations and shown that that is reasonable with some constraints. But I wonder if that's a kind of thing that you are faced with a lot in your discussions about the topic. And it really gets to this nuance of, you know, a lot of people say it's the how, not the cow, and this argument about it's the way we manage the livestock and not just whether we have livestock. And so sometimes I worry that the push about methane emissions from livestock really just sort of throws livestock out altogether. So anyway, let me stop yammering and just see if you have any thoughts or comments about that. Thanks again for your great talk.
Sure. Well, first of all, just seeing something in the chat, I just to clarify, because the EPA chart says 9%, which, as I said, is a couple of years old. This year says 11%, and I used a much bigger number, and I hoped that through that that I don't know what mountain that shows how when you include all the different aspects of agriculture, you do get a much bigger number than the EPA number, particularly changing to a 20-year timescale for methane, which makes that much more important. And one of the questions in the chat does note that a lot of studies show that if you include the food system overall, processing and distribution, the numbers are usually between 30 and 40% of world greenhouse gas emissions. What's tricky is it all depends on what's included. So one of the things I'm trying to say is the number that EPA uses includes very little and much less than is actually affected by farm policy. So if you think about this from a policy perspective, what portion of our emissions can we affect through farm policy? It's much bigger than just that little wedge that EPA says. Randy, going to your question, I think where it gets tricky is that it's not a simple answer. And it is not, in my view, I think the science is pretty clear, is we can't have as many cows as we have now. That's not saying we can't have no cows, but you know, if you look at the American diet, it's enormously beef heavy. It is even more so meat heavy. And it has been largely, although it's trickled off a little bit, it goes up and down, and the rest of the world, unfortunately, is going up. But having some amount of meat is different than having as much as we're now having, which is, by the way, more than the US dietary guidelines recommend. So I think the way to think of it is very simply less beef, better beef, or if you want better beef, less beef. But I don't think I've seen anything to suggest we can have the quantity of beef that we have now without an enormous climate and environmental impact. But for whatever quantity we have, we can certainly dramatically reduce that impact. I think there is, in terms of the ability of say, intense rotational grazing to increase carbon stored in the soil, that there's clearly a lot of benefit from that, and and we are very supportive of that. I think sometimes though its benefits are overstated, and its benefits tend to be not recognized, that it's very region specific. There are some regions of the country where you shift to intense rotational grazing, and it's great from a habitat perspective, and it's great from a water quality and soil erosion perspective. But because of the terrain, say in arid areas or semi-arid areas, you're really not going to be increasing much soil carbon. In areas like Wisconsin and New York, you might, because it's much wetter, you'll be increasing soil carbon more up to a certain limit. Soil gets to a certain saturation. So you're going to, it's not going to be the ability to offset the methane emissions endlessly. So I guess, and I'm not sure if this is a satisfying answer, but I think it is, to whatever extent we are eating beef in particular, although, for example, with pigs, with their waste being dealt with in wet manure lagoons, liquid manure lagoons, we're producing a tremendous amount of methane from that, but that's not from their rumen. So there are things we can do for whatever amount of beef we have, to produce it in a way that produces much less greenhouse gas. And whether we can ever get to carbon neutral beef, I tend to doubt it, given if you take the carbon opportunity costs of land use accurately. And yes, of course, long ago we had grasslands and prairies and buffalo grazing on the prairies, but we have a lot less of that land right now. I think the studies that we cite in the book and the studies that I've seen and that are still coming out suggest, as I said, that we won't have quite the same quantity as we have now. That's leaving aside, by the way, the whole issues of deforestation in Brazil being driven by cattle ranching and soybean production, and whether or not, in theory, cattle can be grown or beef can be grown in a way that doesn't have that. As a practice, once the US started importing beef again from Brazil, we're now, I think, the biggest or second biggest purchaser of beef from Brazil, which is rampant deforestation. And you can say, well, that's over there, but it's all part of one connected.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Carl if you can unmute Diane Meyerfeld. She has 2 or 3 questions and related thoughts here. Thought it'd be a good time to bring you in, Diane.
Yeah, Diane, go ahead. Thanks.
Oh, okay. I was just going to enter my questions in the chat. Well, my first question was just a kind of a specific nitpicky one, which is, I saw that for manure management, you recommended a shift to dry manure management from wet manure management. And I was just curious, and you didn't mention biodigestion. And I was just curious what your thinking is behind. I always thought biodigestion is a big potential help with wet manure management.
Yeah, and so did I at first. But there's a couple of challenges with it. One is dry management of manure just produces a lot less methane. If the manure is dropped on dry ground or managed in a dry fashion, you'll produce the studies suggest about 5% as much methane. So rather than producing a lot of methane and then capturing it, how about just not producing it in the first place? Second of all, the studies on digesters show that they leak a fair amount, and it doesn't take a lot of leaking, especially when you use a 20-year global warming potential, for it to have a pretty significant impact. Third, of course, digesters do nothing for enteric emissions, and they do nothing for the emissions of the manure. When the manure is then spread on fields, you'll get methane and nitrous oxide emissions. Fourth, digesters are exceedingly expensive. Cornell did a study, which is an ag school in New York, did a study and found that digesters are about 15 times more expensive than a cover and flare system. And a cover and flare, you're not capturing the energy, but you're still converting the methane to carbon dioxide. So we have almost the same climate impact for 1/15 the cost. And by and large, digesters have required public support. And there are many of us, and I include myself in that, and in the environmental justice community, that are troubled because digesters, if they can only start making sense at a very large scale, 500 or 1,000 cows or more. And so essentially, if you're going to be putting private money or taxpayer money to support digesters at these larger scale facilities, you're essentially accelerating consolidation and concentration of the meat production. And not only does that have the social and economic and sort of cultural implications, since the digester only addresses it really only addresses the methane from the lagoon. It doesn't address any of the other pollutants. It doesn't address what's being dumped on the fields. It doesn't address water pollution. It doesn't address a lot of the odors. Anyone who is nearby these larger CAFOs don't view digesters as a problem. So like you, I thought, whoa, digesters, hey, isn't that cool? And by the way, I started working for New York City, and we have digesters on our big sewage treatment plants, and that captures all the methane and converts it into energy. And the plants, the sewage treatment plants, are largely run on the energy created by the methane from human poop. So in the right circumstances, food waste digesters or whatever probably make some sense. Whether they and whether they make sense as a as public as the object of public support would be different. If EPA were to choose, as they have the legal authority to do, to put a methane emission limit on a CAFO could decide to do a covered flare for at one price. They could switch to dry manure management and meet the emission limit that way, or they could choose to put on a digester, catch the methane, and sell it. But that would be really up to them making what makes economic choice for them. And so that, from our perspective, makes a lot more sense than taxpayer funding a bunch of digesters. That was a little longer than perhaps you answered than you wanted, but it's a tricky question.
No, and I did want that depth of detail. I just, Germany has managed to obviously have biodigestion for much smaller farms. So it is a question of how you structure that policy environment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there's some folks here with a number of questions. I'm going to encourage you to decide which one you're going to focus on when we get started, because we have a bunch of folks in line. But Jean Schriefer, you asked one, so I'm going to let you jump in. Gene still with us? He may have had to. Yeah.
Nope, I'm still here. Had to find the mute or unmute. My question was regarding methane emissions from ruminant agriculture and whether we're spinning our wheels differentiating between biogenic carbon cycles and anthropogenic carbon cycles. In one case, it's a closed loop. Anthropogenic, we're still pumping fossil fuels out of the ground and emitting it to the atmosphere, increasing the pool there, which is kind of one of the premises of Grasslands 2.0.
If I understand your question, it relates to the argument that, well, if we have the same number of cows, then we have the same number of cow methane, and therefore it's no big deal. And first of all, from a climate perspective, I think there have been many studies and papers saying that that's just not the case. I mean, if you're, if you're in bed and you have a blanket, it's warming you. You don't need to keep adding blankets to be warmed. One blanket is plenty. And that is what's happening to the planet. That methane is trapping greenhouse gases and warming the planet. And second of all, we like to say, well, there's fewer cows and sort of look at that. Many of those are misleading. The average cow is, I think, about 40% bigger than the average cow was 35 years ago, through genetics and feed, et cetera, and produce a lot more emissions than the average cow did before. So facile comparisons to number of cows or number of buffaloes, I think, don't really work. The bottom line is you've got a huge source of methane, which is a pollutant that is having an enormous climate impact. And I think from the perspective of trying to address climate change, this is a source of methane that can be stopped. It's not necessary. I mean, we certainly, there's nothing nutritionally requires us to have this quantity of beef cows or dairy cows. And so that's where much of this comes back to, like so much, to policy and to politics. If I suppose one could try to do a model where all fossil fuel emissions went to zero and everything else went to zero. And if these were the only emissions on the planet, what would be the climate impact? Perhaps less troubling. But that, in my view, and having looked at climate change from the energy sector for a long time, I brought one of the very first climate change lawsuits in 1988. Invents a world that is as I said, in my view, unlikely that we're going to have such success from everywhere else that we don't have to address this major source of this very powerful greenhouse gas.
There's a debate that's been going on here in the chat box related to beef versus the term on the chat is fake beef, fake meat. So plant-based meat. So interested in your thoughts about plant-based meat and its efficacy as a solution, as a meat replacement, as a climate solution.
And this is where it's a great question, because it shows that we're talking about food that people care about and people choose, and has not just, it's not simply like filling your car. We care about what we eat. It's not just a toothpaste tube of whatever 2,000 calories of all the right nutrients. And so the advantage that plant-based meats and which are now widely available, cultured meats may become available, they're still not commercially available, is for those who want to have a lesser climate impact, but still have something that looks like hamburger. And I think from a political or social perspective, it's shown that there's a lot of people that are beginning to think about the climate impact of their food choices. And yet they want something that looks and feels like a hamburger. I personally don't particularly like them, but I like eating plants. And so I don't miss eating a slaughtered meat hamburger. So that's my personal choice, but others who really like those hamburgers but want to have a lower impact can definitely move to them. I think there are then, you can complicate the issue. There's no question, I think the studies are pretty solid that a plant-based burger will have fewer environmental impacts for the most part or virtually any perspective, water use, land use, or climate change impact, than a hamburger from a slaughtered cow. There are those who argue for something like Impossible Burger, which is more heavily processed as opposed to a classic veggie burger that is sort of ground up vegetables, or a mushroom burger. And those could have other concerns. At this point, there's probably many more different types of plant-based burgers than there are those of us on this call. So they're going to have different, some of the impacts will differ in their nuances. But again, to summarize, I think from my own perspective, for those portions of the consuming public, and it's significant, that pay attention to or beginning to pay attention to the climate footprint of their diet, and yet still want something that looks and feels like at least a meat or a hamburger, they can be an important alternative.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of switch us now, not a full pivot, but an orienting shift here from the nature of the problem to the nature of the solutions and the potential pragmatics around changes in federal policy. And I'm going to start with a note here from Valerie Dantoin. And Val, I'm talking about the one where you're talking about addressing what you say is a root policy problem, subsidies of corn and soy. So are you interested in elaborating on your question?
Sure. I think if we think the free market is supposed to work, and most folks who are in that camp, why don't we let the marketplace work and take the subsidies away from corn and soy, rather than even trying to supplement grazing with more money, taxpayer money. And I think we would see what would win out in the marketplace. And I also want the idea of, if you are doing corn and soy, like my neighbor for the last 30 years, that's all that has been on his field. No break, no small grains, no pasture, no nothing. He is basically ruining that farmland for generations to come. And why are we subsidizing that? That's my big question. And then we're all getting fat on corn and soy anyway. So we're wrecking a whole lot of things when we keep the subsidy going. So why don't we campaign to stop that, and that you got to rotate into corn and soy, or out of corn and soy and into a small grain at least 2 years out of 6.
So one of it's important, there are a lot of subsidies through the commodity payments, through a heavily subsidized crop insurance system where the premiums are about 65% subsidized by the taxpayer for corn and soy. There's also there's subsidies of a different sort for, say, sugar beets and sugar cane by having import limitations and price supports. Under the conservation program, under EQIP, for example, half of the money has to go to livestock operations. Most of it goes to CAFOs. There's of course grazing subsidies because federal grazing land is leased out at a tiny fraction of market rate. And of course, to some extent, you could even argue that agricultural property tax exemptions are a form of subsidy for agriculture. So one point is that there's subsidies for corn and soy, and there's a lot of other subsidies for agriculture throughout the system. And the United States is not alone. Many countries have significant agricultural subsidies in order to provide cheaper food, or perhaps or for sort of employment reasons and rural livelihood, reasons. One of the interesting things that sometimes people posit is, imagine a world if you had none of these subsidies, if you had you did have a free market where people who had land could grow what they want and they would take the risk. And by the way, the farms I manage are in a country where they're not in the US, where there's no crop insurance, there's no commodity payments. When you have a bad year, it sucks. Sorry, it's right there. It's very different. And farmers in those countries are far more responsive to climate change because they have no protection. And so on the one hand, these subsidies have been viewed as important to provide a sort of a safety net, there it's called, for both farmers and for our food system. But that safety net has insulated farmers from responding to the realities of climate change in a way that farmers in other countries, even though there are subsidies in other countries, in many places, they're not nearly as big as they are here. The agricultural sector is responding more quickly. But it would be a massive policy and societal change and would probably end up being food more expensive, but that would arguably then drive people to pay people more so they could afford better food. So that's sort of a bigger societal transformation than we address. I think a lot of what's interesting is a lot of the practices that we're talking about are, especially once they get going, are actually more profitable. And one of the things you see is farmers who have adopted these practices tend never to go back. They find these practices are more productive, more profitable, and certainly more satisfying and more healthy. And so we just have to try to encourage that. And I'm seeing in the chat, one of the troubles, of course, with the subsidies is many of them are some of them are extremely administratively hard to access, and others require enough administrative hassle that it only makes sense if you're large scale, or if you're a large scale monoculture, it doesn't work as well for an integrated farm. And one of the things the Biden administration is doing is trying to increase the accessibility to these farm subsidies by small, disadvantaged farmers, BIPOC farmers, indigenous, and others who have been historically excluded from the farm programs. So that's not sort of changing them at the highest level, but changing them sort of at the micro administrative level. We don't have to change the program entirely, but let's really make it easier for even the small, more organic or integrated or agroecological farmers who before haven't been able to access these programs, to at least access these programs. So I think politically, what you're going to see more is not so much an end to the subsidies, but perhaps some slight shifting of where the subsidies are going. And similarly, USDA is trying to think about, could we, instead of subsidizing, as I said earlier, practices that are demonstrably harmful for our climate and the environment, let's have the same subsidy, but subsidize practices that are beneficial. So not get rid of them, but change them, tweak them, enhance them.
So I'm wanting to reflect upon your statement, both in the book and then today in your presentation, about the very high cost to our healthcare system, to our health, to public health, of the industrialized row crop agriculture and the meat, that the system of meat production that it supports, and the levels of hypertension and obesity and heart disease and other cancers that are related. There are many health dimensions of this health crisis, and ask a question about political feasibility here. I've worked for a lot of farm bills. I don't remember, I haven't gone back and counted recently, but there's been a lot of farm bills that I've worked on, and we have never once failed to try to take on these structural issues that are really at the heart and the soul of a lot of what you're proposing. Yes, we can improve and increase conservation programming, and we've done that rather well. But when we've tried to take on the subsidies one way and another, payment limitations and other strategies, we've got whooped upside the head. And that's not surprising when you look at the extreme strength of the agricultural lobby. So I have suggested this year that we really build out relationships with the health insurance industry, which absorbs a lot of that $1 trillion a year cost, not all of it, but a good part of it. And they have a vested interest. I'm just curious what you think about that. Is that realistic? What are the other game changers that we have that we can turn to? We're not going to change it just because it should be changed. We're going to have to develop and enlist new constituencies, not just constituencies that believe in it, but have power. Who are those constituencies? What do you think about the health insurance being one of them?
Totally agree. That's chapter 2 of our book. And actually just our chapter 2, we really only address some of the rural constituencies that are largely ignored. Farm policy tends to assume that rural communities and farmers are one and the same. And of course, farmers right now, the actual productive farmers, the about 500,000 farmers at most that produce the vast majority of our food, are a tiny fraction of rural communities. And of course, many of them, the ones who own the land, tend not to be the same as the ones who are working on the land. Farm workers are different than farm landowners. And so even within rural communities, the farm policy is being made by a really small sector of those who are affected. It's not really being made by those who are upstream or downwind, or the farm workers or the other neighbors who have to smell the CAFOs. And then there's, of course, those who eat. And even leaving aside the health insurance industry, arguably, we should all have an interest in a farm policy that actually supports food that is healthy for us. And then there's also the health insurance industry. So I'm trying to put your question, which Margaret, I agree with. They're a very, very important player, but one of many important players that are traditionally excluded. We have this farm policy, as I said at the beginning, that for really decades is largely driven by the agrochemical companies and this coalition of the few largest producers, and everybody else is left out. And part of what I think is so important is to have all these other voices start participating. There was a great article, I think it was 4 years ago before, or maybe about that, Ricardo Salvador, Mark Bittman, Michael Pollan, and a few others said, among other things, we should have a Department of Food, not a Department of Agriculture. I mean, Department of Agriculture, it's really an unusual federal agency focused on supporting a sector rather than sort of oversight of a part of our life. This isn't like, it's not overseeing how our food affects us. It is supporting the agricultural production. And they pointed out that the health insurance industry, like they said, where are you guys? How come you haven't paid more attention to this? And so the short answer to that is, I don't know. I wish they would pay more attention to it. And I should say, by the way, the impact, of course, is in part we eat more meat than the dietary guidelines recommend. We eat a lot more sugar than the dietary guidelines recommend. And farm policy dramatically, very heavily supports sugar beets and sugar canes and high fructose corn syrup. So the health impacts are, of course, not just in the food we eat, but the fact that so much of the food has food residues of pesticides. So it's a whole series of ways that our current food system has that $1 trillion of impact.
I'm going to open the forum to Kelly Millibrandt, who's asking a question about cover crops and crop rotations and what it takes to bring about some changes there. I'm inviting any other questions around the constituency building that we need to do to bring about change in the next farm bill, and the specific recommendations and policy recommendations. That's where I'm really hoping to orient things. So any questions around those, I'd love to see them in the chat, and then we'll call on you. So Kelly? Carl, are you opening it up for Kelly to speak?
Yeah,
Kelly Miller.
some folks may
Hildebrand.
not be able to unmute or up for
I-
unmuting.
okay.
We can also just go ahead and ask that question.
Okay,
Well, I can read what
Oh,
Kelly
yeah,
wrote in
thanks,
the
Peter.
chat. If I understand it correctly, we and many others are super supportive of cover crops. Absolutely, it's a great practice. It's shocking to me, honestly. The idea that cover crops, it varies a little bit by state, but overall, I think the average overall in the US is like 5% of cropland has cover crops, which means 95% of cropland is bare in December and in January, which is sort of insane. And so one of the things we should all be looking at are ways, and the crop insurance system for a while really discouraged cover crops. That was largely fixed in the 2018 Farm Bill, but they still don't get any benefit for it. And so that's where we're trying to develop, we and our allies, have pilot projects, because you have to have all sorts of actuarial data, et cetera, in order to provide something like what you call the good driver discount, the better practice discount for your crop insurance. There's also the possibility, the conservation compliance program, which is sort of a very few requirements that applies if you get any money under the commodity program, the crop insurance program, or the conservation programs. You have to comply with the sod saver and swamp buster programs, which can't convert swampland. You have to have a plan for highly erodible land. Very poorly overseen, doesn't apply to all land, doesn't really ask much. But that basic deal, which is, hey, we're giving literally $20 billion a year in subsidies, isn't it reasonable to ask in return that at least you're not polluting too much? So I think there'd be opportunity to add to conservation or compliance requirements. If you're taking these federal subsidies, you do something for it. And many people think that cover crops would be one of the, cover crops or riparian buffers would be a couple of the very basic things you would do on cropland and would make a tremendous difference. A riparian buffer doesn't have to be that big to reduce runoff into the water by 90%. So cover crops are terrific for sure.
One of the conversations that we've had at the national level around conservation compliance has pertained to the fact that it worked reasonably well at the very beginning, after the 85 Farm Bill. It worked for a number of years, and then frankly, we piled on more and more onto it and encumbered it, and there was less and less staff. And it became something of a farce. Maybe a farce is too strong a word, but it became commonly understood as an unenforced expectation. And it no longer had teeth. It no longer has teeth, present tense. And the question is, can we, in fact, hold expectations? There's one proposal that in order to get crop insurance, you need to put together a comprehensive farm plan, conservation plan, and climate included in that conservation plan. Others say, if we're going to do it, need to have it enforced. What are the realities of that? You were involved in watching that, the unfolding of that conservation compliance. What does it take to have meaningful conservation compliance so that whatever standards we try to impose, we actually make real?
There was I think it was a USDA IG report that looked into conservation compliance, and they themselves found it was just, terrible oversight, inconsistently implemented, if at all. If you recall back to the slides I showed, one of them was essentially we need more staff to oversee. And one of the things I saw in the chat was that cover crops are complicated. And the answer is yeah. If I'm a farmer growing something in New York, what I do for a cover crop is going to be different than what somebody in Iowa does or Wisconsin does or California or whatever, in terms of how I manage it, what I grow, when I do it, how I interseed it, et cetera, et cetera. We need, for all of these practices, some technical help. And I know, again, from the farms I deal with, that when you're doing something new, A, it's scary, and B, there's a lot of details you don't know. So you think, okay, the concept, I'm okay, I'll give it a try. But then all of these questions come up, and who is going to help you? If right now your only source of information is the fertilizer salesman, they're not going to help you. And if the technical and extension outreach staff has been cut by 75%, there's nobody there to help you. So if we're serious about changing this, how we are farming, we're just going to need a lot of people trying it out, sharing the information. That goes back to the data transparency issue I talked about, and a lot more staff helping them. And then the financial assistance can be either to help them for their initial equipment, to loan some equipment, to guarantee you can do a crop insurance that's focused on if you try something new and it doesn't work, you're protected from your first couple of years mistakes type of things. So all of these are possible and frankly necessary if we're going to create the change.
Well, we are just about at time. Thank you for that answer, for the many answers, for your the stirring of the pot. You brought a lot of people interested in a lot of topics and inspired a lot of excitement and conversation, and I hope active engagement. Thank you again for a really high quality book that I plan to use for years to come, and for the clear intention that you're bringing to facilitating public engagement in this part of government policy that sometimes falls between a lot of people, the cracks in a lot of people's worlds. So thank you so much again, Peter. Thank you, and Grassland 2.0 leadership, thanks for having scheduled such a great talk. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Take care. Bye-bye.